Based on the comic of the same name written by Daniel Clowes, Ghost World 2001 is a perfect comic to movie adaptation. Any kind of film adaptation can learn something from this movie in terms of translating a story from one medium to another. It's not an adaptation like Watchmen, for example, which painstakingly recreates imagery from the comic while completely missing the deeper meaning of the story. No, in fact, Ghost World takes a lot of creative liberties from its source material. However, it maintains its theme, characterization, and vibes throughout. Directed by Terry Zwigoff, Ghost World is a teen movie that's entirely unlike its contemporary teen movies. Don't expect gross-out humor or MILF jokes. In fact, expect the complete opposite of whatever you've come to expect from typical teen movies.
All these movies suck.
There's so much magic in the world.
Both the comic and the movie are drenched in Generation X irony, angst, and bleak humor. The movie stars Thora Birch, young ScarJo, and Steve Buscemi if you need any more incentive to see it. In short, it's about two friends, Enid and Rebecca, who are stuck in a liminal space between childhood and adulthood. Enid and Rebecca are entirely irony poisoned. They're unable and unwilling to enjoy anything sincerely. They put on a front that everything is a joke, and they only like things because they're so bad it's good.
Wow, this is so bad, it's almost good. This is so bad, it's gone past good and back to bad again.
Enid knows something is missing from their lives, but she doesn't know that that something is sincerity. That same theme, story, motivation are present in both the comic and the movie, but where it differs is the plot, the actual events of the movie. Why do they differ? Well, despite the fact that a lot of movies now are based on them, comics are a wildly different medium than film. I mean, they're similar in that they're both primarily visual, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. Each medium has its own strengths, and so the possibilities between films and comics are completely different. I think that a lot of us underestimate just how unique comics are as a medium. In his book Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud digs into the qualities and methods of comics in a really illuminating way. I have been reading comics since before I could read, and even I learned a lot from this book. One of the key differentiators he points out is the comics medium's relationship with time. In film and television, the audience has an entirely linear experience of time. The present is happening on screen right this second, the past already happened, and the future is still to come. Whereas on the page of a comic book, the present, past, and future exist all at once on the same page. Time is determined by a panel's relationship to its space on the page, as well as by the placement of dialogue and sound effects. In Western comics, events take place from left to right, top to bottom. But a reader can always see the future and the past, no matter what panel they're on.
I can see through time.
Quote McCloud,
"Wherever your eyes are focused, that's now. But at the same time, your eyes take in the surrounding landscape of past and future."
Comics also have the crucial element of the gutter, the space between panels. It might not be something that us readers pay much attention to, but the gutter is in fact where most of the action takes place. This is where our brains are forced to fill in the gaps from moment to moment, to create movement between consecutive still images or move from one setting to another. The gutter is the part that engages our imaginations and makes a comic book come to life. The reason I bring all of this up is because these are some of the key qualities of experiencing comics as a medium. It's what sets it apart from just being an image with writing on it that needs to be translated to the big screen. All of this to say, comics are so different from movies, and that's the way they should be. There's no way to make a direct panel-to-screen adaptation, and it's almost futile to try, unless there were dozens of moving panels on the movie theater screen at once. Has anyone done that yet? Legendary director Brian De Palma does a lot of split screen in his movies, but his stuff never came close to adapting any comics. I know Ang Lee tried to evoke comic book panels in his Hulk movie as well, and while I applaud the experimentation, it largely came across as awkward and forced. It's hard or impossible to pull off true accuracy because each medium is so different, and therefore it's more important to be accurate to the source material's themes and characters. Because if you want comic accurate, read the comic. So how does Ghost World the comic use its medium to tell its story? Well, the comic doesn't really have a singular linear narrative thread the way a traditional movie might. Comics are inherently episodic most of the time, and so Ghost World consists of a series of short stories following the same characters through their late teen malaise. The episodic style and lack of singular plotline contribute to the detached nature of the book's characters. It conveys the feeling of floating through life with no end goal in mind. This book is heavy on dialogue, and its humor is confrontationally deadpan. It pokes fun at right-wing edgelord teenagers, strip mall America, and even the comics writer himself. It seems completely ironic and irreverent in the early chapters, but then eventually ends on a much-needed sense of sincerity. One of the things things that makes this comic so strong is its episodic nature, as each issue is about 5 pages with a tight setup and punchline, making for a very brisk read that's hard to put down. While the structure works really well for a comic book, it's not something that can really be adapted directly for the screen. When Clowes was initially adapting his book for the screen, he said,
"On Ghost World, I started by trying to transcribe the comic into Final Draft. I figured that's how you do an adaptation. Then I tried throwing everything away and writing an entirely new story that was very different from the book. And I synthesized those two things into a final screenplay."
So yeah, the plot of the movie is really different from the comic, but because Clowes wrote both, the movie feels incredibly close in spirit to the comic book. Obviously, the characterization is on point, and the heart of the story remains completely intact. More than an adaptation, Ghost World the movie is like a perfect companion to the book, and vice versa. Daniel Clowes flexes his ability to write weird one-off characters that are so specifically strange. Many show up in his book, but he's added a bunch of new ones to the movie that, in my opinion, are even better.
Rock and roll, baby. Freedom of speech.
And having Terry Zwigoff direct was also a huge plus for this movie, as he has an obvious love for weird comics, and his own eccentricities as a director fit perfectly into this world. Just watching the movie, you can tell the two clearly had a very strong working relationship, because the final film feels incredibly singular in its execution and vision. Said Clowes,
"With Terry, I was very much there the whole time and kind of a Coen Brothers-ish scenario. We were bouncing ideas off each other and it felt fairly collaborative."
if there was any significant studio meddling, it doesn't come across in the film, and that's ideal for a comic book adaptation. A lot of dialogue is pulled entirely from the book, and like I said, the characters are 100% accurate. But of course, film is completely different from comics, and so the structure and plot are shaped to better fit the medium. Rather than keeping the short, episodic nature of the book, the movie hones in on a single story from the comics and then expands on it. Through the expansion of the Seymour story, played by Steve Buscemi, not only does his character get a lot more depth and purpose, but the film is also able to weave that story through some of the other memorable moments from the comic, as well as have all new bizarre scenarios in the Ghost World setting. Effectively, several separate story threads are tied together for a more traditional plot line. The result is a completely different plot that still communicates the same story as the comic did. The tone and sense of humor are the same, but because it's a movie, there's also more room for visual gags and physical humor. Thora Birch was great casting, as she's cool as hell, and made Enid a lot more likable than she was in the comics. A lot of her dialogue and motivation are exactly the same as the book. I just think her delivery brought the character to life in a more sympathetic way. She sells a lot of lines that could have come across as entirely unlikable by bringing a feeling of uncertainty to her detached absolutism. Even though the plot she's involved in is completely different, she's still the same irony-poisoned teenager who picks up counterculture trends and drops them in a desperate attempt to define her true self. Also, I have to mention how great she looks in all these kitschy outfits that she wears throughout the movie. In both versions, Enid is trapped in a dead-end feeling of irony and indifference. She's desperate for sincerity and purpose in life. In the comic book, she finds it by retreating to a childhood record, a sincerity through nostalgia. By contrast, in the movie, she finds it through the character of Seymour, who serves as a really confusing mentor figure and eventually a sort of sad older reflection of Enid's desperation. Both versions of Ghost World end very ambiguously though, as it's unclear if Enid gets what she needs out of her life. And I'm glad for that. I'm glad the movie didn't try to land a happy ending or an ending that was more concrete, because that mysterious in-between state is a core aspect of the story and fits right into the rest of the themes. It belongs in any version of Ghost World. Ghost World is a great movie to look at when considering comic book movie adaptations. It's not concerned with surface level page accuracy. It doesn't matter if that exact imagery is translated to the film, because each medium will communicate that image differently. What's more important in an adaptation is to maintain the same message or the same feeling. The plot and the raw moment-to-moment events will change when translating from one medium to another. If they don't, then the adaptation isn't using its medium to its fullest. Ghost World the comic and Ghost World the movie are very different, but both leave the audience with the same message. Sincerity and authenticity cannot be achieved through ironic detachment, and you need some kind of sincerity to find your purpose in life. Only engaging with the world ironically is a dead-end way to live. The way that message is communicated in comics and on film is completely different, and that's the way it should be, because if you want comic accuracy, go read the comic. It's not going anywhere. Shout out to Matt Hall for lending his voice for this video. He did an awesome job and he's literally one of my favorite people. I definitely recommend you go check out his channel, Matt Hall Collections. He does sketches and rankings and reviews of movies. I want to give a big thank you to my generous Patreon producers, Caleb Mayer and Greta Harris, for their support. You're the best.